Discover prototypical track and turnouts with the Roadmaster series from Oak Hill Model Railroad Track Supply. Proudly made in the United States, Oak Hill's handcrafted turnouts provide unparalleled detail and accuracy, giving your layout museum-quality track work at an affordable price. Whether fully built or in easy-to-assemble kit form, Roadmaster provides all the details of real track. Looking for a custom piece of track work? Oak Hill can help with custom turnouts, diamonds, crossings, and more. Check out all of their offerings on their website, ohrtracksupply.com. Attention railroad fans! 1810 Designs is here to enhance the hobby with handcrafted works of art made just for you. From classic locomotive railheads to custom logos for your railroad, or maybe just good old railroad signs, they bring the spirit of the rails into your home, office, or train room. Visit 1810designs.com today and bring the railroad home. That's 18ten designs.com. ATLP Extra is our monthly newsletter delivered right to your inbox each month. Sign up for free at atlpextra.com.
ATLP Rewind.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. On tonight's episode, we have Matt Freix. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here. Matt, we got to meet in person fairly recently at the you had come out from where you're out in Illinois, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm in the Chicago area.
Yeah, so you made your way out here for the big Amherst show, and you brought along a couple friends, I believe, and met with a group. And I got to meet you because you came over to Mark Herrick's BNSF Montana Division layout with the group, and you did some operating there, and we immediately put you in the most busiest and maybe the most challenging spot to switch. So what was your take on that?
It's a beautiful layout. It was a blast. I feel like I was a little bit of a glutton for punishment. Just kind of dove in, and Mark tells me that it was successful. I thought it was a little bit of a disaster on my end, but apparently he said, I think no one's ever finished it on their first time.
Right.
And I did. So I'm going to take it as a win for the home team.
Yeah, to finish it is a huge accomplishment. We kind of joked that there should be a sticker. We've done the stickers in 2023. You can't model railroad without a sticker in 2023, it seems. But there should be a special one for anybody who finishes the Columbia Falls job, because that is a very challenging one. I've done it, I think, twice, and I was challenged to finish it, and you certainly did a great job for doing it your first time.
I think Don Iris was dispatching from Florida. And I feel like I'm very glad that he was in Florida, because if he was there personally, I think he might have tried to strangle me if I asked for the main one more time.
Yeah, it's really neat what we're able to do with that. You mentioned we did remote dispatching with that, with Don being in Florida with the BNSF, and he does it for a couple others up here in the New England area as well. But he's a pretty patient guy for the most part, and it's good to challenge him. It's good to keep the dispatcher on his toes for sure.
I didn't hold up any trains, so. And
that's key. That's key. So you also had, your group, you had yourself, you had a past guest here, two past guests of Around the Layout. We had Dave Oppensano and we had Chris Palmieri. And then also joining you was Butch Eiler. So had a really nice group there on that Friday before Amherst over at Mark's to run trains. It was really cool that you were able to, with the whole group to join us to do that. And then you had a couple other stops on that Friday prior to the show as well. Tell us about those.
Yeah. So, actually, so Thursday I flew in to Pennsylvania from Chicago, and I spent the night with Dave, got to see his layout. And then in classic military / pilot fashion, Dave had us up at, I think, 3 or 4 in the morning. And we headed out to New York, and we had breakfast and a layout visit with Ken Karlowitz and his D&H layout. Then from there, we shot over to Mark's, and I think we were there with y'all for, 3-4 hours?
Yeah, it was a good long operating session. You guys, between Columbia Falls and then Butch was running over in Hauser and did switching there. And, Chris Palmieri was doing some through trains, and then he switched the new ethanol plant of Mark. So, yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on that layout that day.
Yeah, we did that. And then we drove from there up to I think it was the Worcester area. Pardon my accent and my butchery of New England namesakes.
We can fix that real quick. That's called Worcester.
Worcester.
Yeah, Worcester. Yeah, Worcester. Yeah. So you were up in Worcester. What'd you do up in Worcester? Went
to Neil Schofield's. Spent the evening there. Caught up with Ken again. He had made it in from New York. There was a ton of people over there. He was having an open house. In the power of the internet and all this Facebook stuff that we're doing in the groups, there was a gentleman there, and the name slips my mind right now, but he was in town from Colorado for the show. And he had stopped by, and we were talking, and he's like, you're the guy with that Gateway Western layout. And I was like, son of a gun, man. I wasn't expecting that, New England.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? That just, the power of social media, and when you put yourself out there and the people that will take notice and notice it from afar is super cool. So,
yeah, we didn't get back in until I think 10:30 at night. So that was a long day.
Yeah, that is a long day, but a good day of definitely taking advantage of being up in New England and seeing some great layouts, and between Ken Karlowitz and Neil Schofield and Mark Herrick, you definitely got to take in some really nice layouts, and being able to spend some time with Dave, like you said, down in Pennsylvania is awesome. That's another layout. You've mentioned at least 3 layouts that I need to go see personally. I've not been able to see Neil Schofield's yet. I haven't seen Ken Karlowitz yet, and I certainly haven't seen Dave's other in pictures. But looking forward to one day getting over there and getting an eye on them as well.
Yeah.
So, talk about Amherst show. So, now you got all those op sessions, and then you roll into the Amherst show. Have you been to Amherst prior to this?
Never.
Oh, so your first time at Amherst. What was your impression of it?
I'll tell you this. So, really, I don't get out to a ton of shows. I lived in St. Louis for a bit, so I'd go to RPM in Collinsville every now and again. And this last winter or fall, I went to Train Fest in Milwaukee, and I was like, wow, this is big. And Dave and Butch had actually flown into Milwaukee, and Dave was telling me, man, you got to come to Amherst. He said, it is going to blow your mind. He said, if you think this is big, like, you don't know what you're in for. And so that's what spurred the trip. And I was just like, holy Lord, like another building in another building, in another building. And it was both mentally and physically exhausting.
For sure.
Yeah.
Were you able to do Amherst in one day, or did you do both days of Amherst?
We were able to knock it out in one day. Yeah, I would say physically, I don't know if I was ready for a second day. But we spent the better part of the day there, and then got together with some people afterwards for dinner, and kind of called it a night. And I think Butch and Dave drove back to Pennsylvania that night, and I shacked up at the airport and flew out the next morning.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, a good experience. You get to see that. It is exhausting, especially the Saturday, because it was their biggest day. And then you're trying to like get through all the people too, because you're weaving through people and making sure you see everything. So to get it in one day is certainly exhausting. I know I was exhausted by the end of Saturday, and then I came back for Sunday and I was already tired, and Sunday was a little bit lighter day. So that definitely helped. But my feet were screaming by the end of the day on Sunday, walking on all that concrete, but well worth it. It was good to see the show back. To where getting closer to where its glory was with prior to the pandemic, and then obviously the weather was fantastic too. So that was a huge thing. So I was glad that your first experience with Amherst went well.
Yeah, I could see myself coming back.
I'll be looking forward to that, and we'll be definitely looking to do some more operating sessions with you guys when you come in. And it's definitely a great time in beyond the show, just the socialization and everything else that goes along with it just makes it a great event.
I was joking with Mark the other day, and I told him, I said, man, I'm gonna have to just catch a flight out there to operate.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we're always looking for guys to join us in our rotation. So definitely wherever you travel, and there's so many really cool sites for that too now. And as you mentioned, the social media stuff, you just pop in that area, and you can probably find an operating session to drop in if you're out of town. I know quite a few people that have done that. So let's get back to you and in your story here. Why don't we start with how you got started in the hobby of model railroading?
So I grew up, probably easy to confuse my accent with the ones up there you have in the Northeast, but my dad was in the military. I grew up in South Carolina, or I should say early childhood in South Carolina. And, we didn't have a ton of trains in the area. It was mostly branch line stuff. But my mom, she was from Dayton, Ohio. And, my grandfather, he was just an avid, model railroader, had the layout in the basement, huge B&O chassis fan. So I actually this was in the 80s, and we had some old, I think, Seaboard coastline or airline branch lines that were, now CSX. So we had just the mixture of, Seaboard family lines, chassis, CSX, all that stuff in South Carolina. And I really latched onto it. And as I said, my dad was in the military. So after a while in South Carolina, he made his last transfer, and we got transferred to Kansas City. Well, actually Fort Leavenworth. But I think one of the really big things I remember is my mom and I, we were driving from South Carolina to Kansas City for the first time. And I remember driving through Kansas City, and just on the west side of downtown, when you're on I-70, you dump into the West Bottoms, and there are just trains everywhere. And I was like, holy Lord, I'd never seen anything like that, coming from these little sleepy branch lines. And now I'm on, Union Pacific's 18th Street yard, and there's junctions everywhere, and Southern Pacific's Armourdale yard. And this was in 91. So, it was just jumping, and I was like, man, this is incredible. And then as we kind of got settled in, we started exploring the area, and I found a junction. I'm sure a lot, or most people on this have heard of it, is Santa Fe Junction. And this is just the beehive in Kansas City. And back in the 90s, you could sit there and have 7 trains moving around you at one time. Wow. And we're talking Santa Fe, Union Pacific, Chicago Northwestern, Southern Pacific, Sioux Line, Kansas City Terminal, all that stuff. And then the Gateway Western. what I model now. And it just, it all came together. I held on to that love of trains that my grandfather had. And then I just happened to get transplanted into a place that really, kind of fed that interest. And I became, a nut about the prototype and a nut about modeling at the same time.
Yeah, it's amazing how, to be surrounded that much with the prototype and have that influence really drives, the modeling, and certainly an advantage to have your grandfather as a model railroader as well. Talk about that. I mean, when you started modeling, you saw what he was modeling, and were you modeling, and kind of what was his kind of influence in that?
I didn't do a lot of modeling. As a kid, I read a lot about it. I had a ton of cousins, and I was always kind of the one grandchild that he let really get a hold of the controls down there, because he said that I actually operated the trains and I didn't just run them fast. But it was just fun. I loved hanging out and, operating the trains. And then as I got a little bit older, I want to say, I think it was in middle school, and finally, I don't know if con's the right word, or beat my parents into submission that they bought a 4x8 piece of plywood for me and threw it in the basement. And we're like, there you go.
Well, hey, it got it done, whether you conned them or otherwise, there it is, right? So you've got yourself a start. So, what did you start modeling on this 4x8 sheet of plywood?
It's the classic, kids layout. I had, I'd be running a train with like a, 70s era Athearn Jeep B&O Jeep 7 with like a 5-pack, impact spine car behind it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just, looking back on it, man, I had a blast, but my prototype modeling self today just like cringes.
Well, you didn't know any better. You got to start somewhere, and it certainly got you started and whatnot. So, yeah, did you get into any scenery on it, or was it just all about running the train around?
It's so funny you said that, because I was about to say, I look back, it literally like just piles of unsifted, like untreated dirt that I took down there and put on. I'm sure there's like bugs crawling everywhere, but it was literally just like raw dirt with like, I had one small package of Woodland Scenics lichen, or however you pronounce it.
Yep.
And that was the scenery.
Hey, you get started somewhere, right? And you're at least trying to get it done. And, so when do you start learning the difference? When you've got this 4x8 sheet of plywood, and you're making some attempts at scenery. What really started to take it to the next level? Well,
so I very quickly started to find that I was really into the real thing, and I was into operations, and, this is when people, I didn't really know anybody. And, just from reading, a lot of people weren't like operating the way we do today. It was more just running trains.
Right.
But I knew that I wanted accurate models and things like that. And I didn't have the skill level, we're in the blue box era. I wasn't about to try and custom paint and stuff like that. So I almost stepped back from the model railroad side of things, and I really spent a lot of time just learning everything I could, about the real thing. Did a lot of rail fanning and just watched stuff, and that really continued. I mean, for a good while. And then I started getting more serious I'm going to say probably around 2010, I was really thinking to myself, like, man, I want to build a layout. And that's when I built a bedroom size first version of the layout I have now. And it was really simple. I didn't have a chance to get any scenery up before we ended up moving from Kansas City to St. Louis. But when I was there in Kansas City, I had the chance to meet some really awesome people. So I didn't live too far from my good friend now, Eric Goodman, who is an avid Santa Fe modeler. He shares an interest in the Gateway Western, nowhere near as much as mine. But, we spent a lot of time together. I helped him do some work on his last layout. And then, we talked a little bit ago about, the power of the internet and Facebook. I ended up linking up with Joe Atkinson, who was in his Iowa Interstate layout, I think was in 2010, 9 or 11 model railroad planning. And I remember reading that article and I was just like, man, I really dig this, because he was into like car movements and really replicating exactly how the Iowa Interstate moved cars, down to specifically exactly what cars were moving, and not just a representation, but really like reproducing that. And I knew that with the Gateway Western, I wanted to do something similar when I modeled it. So I started researching and asking questions. And I think it was on train orders. I got this random message on train orders, and it was this guy, Joe Atkinson, who was like, hey man, I saw some of your questions and like, I think we like the same stuff. And he and I ended up connecting, and we became really good friends. I know I made multiple trips. He's in the Council Bluffs, Omaha area. And I made multiple trips from Kansas City up there to operate with him. And, we're friends to this day, hell, almost 13 years later.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, the power of the internet and social media. And like you said, train board, and find a common link and make a new friend that way.
Yeah. Definitely. And I look, I'm a very social person, but I don't have, a very large group that I, really communicate with regularly. And to this day, I think my main model railroading, venue is a group text message, that I have with my buddy, Ryan Crawford, who he models the, Chicago and Illinois Midland in the late 80s. Joe Atkinson, that we just discussed, models the Iowa Interstate, and I think the early 2000s. And then Isaac Fabris, who models the Canadian National, a little spur branch line here in Illinois. And that's really that group of people. That's kind of my nerve center.
Yeah, what kind of pulled all of that together? So you met Joe Atkinson, and then did it kind of go out from there? Like Joe knows some people, and did it kind of work like that?
No, so I met Joe, and I met Joe, and then I moved to St. Louis for work, and I was in St. Louis for a while. Didn't really meet many people there, but I did meet Ryan Crawford. He lived in the Springfield, Illinois area. And, he was a fan of the Gateway. And so he and I became friends. And then, I moved up to the Chicago area, and I met Isaac, through Facebook, if I remember right. And Isaac and Ryan and we all started, talking. And then I was like, man, we're all prototype nuts. And I said, I got to get Joe in on this conversation, because I think we're all pretty like-minded. Right. And brought us all together. And, we're, I think, a couple of years in on a pretty strong group chat.
Yeah, it's just amazing how it all starts to tie together. And I joke that, they talk about 7 degrees of separation. I think it's far less degrees in model railroading, where you start to one person to connect, and you start, by the time before you know it, you've really made the loop back around and really connected with a great group of people.
Well, you're telling me, because like Joe, he's our interstate guy, and he always joked that the Gateway Western was very Iowa interstate-esque. So they have what they call their Iowa Interstate Mafia, and they invited me to be an honorary member. And so Joe introduced me to Scott Thornton, who you've had on the program,
right?
And James McNabb, and a whole other group of people there, and become friends with them. And then at RPM in Collinsville, Scott Thornton introduced me to Butch and Dave, who I became friends with, who brought me out to the Northeast to meet y'all. So, I mean, it just shows you some pretty Kevin Bacon, 6 degrees of separation type stuff there.
Yeah. Yeah, 6, 7, 5, 4. It's just less and less and less, and then it's pretty amazing that it's a big hobby with a lot of people, but still somehow very close knit. It's like you can't really go, there's you can't go too far out without reconnecting back to where you've started. It's pretty amazing.
Well, and I think too, to that point, I am hyper focused and interested in recreating realistic operations.
Right.
So that takes, me into kind of a very specific rabbit hole of the hobby. And, there's even fewer of us out there. So I feel like we kind of congregate together, kind of like moss on a flame.
So yeah, talk about that. What kind of you want to, what's your standard for operating? What are the kind of the things that need, that satisfy you for operations?
I like recreating. I like recreating, what moved on the real layout, or on the real railroad, I should say. I am very, very interested in researching car movements, and then using that data to create, train consists that are as accurate as possible, and that are actual freight movements that happened on the railroad. I know I'm the psychopath, out there. Most people are like, oh yeah, I've seen this car and I saw that car, and they create the look and the feel. And then I take it into a really like almost unhealthy zone of like, no, I've got to know where did it load at? What routing did it take to get across the country? Where was it going? Everything. So that's what really, drives me.
I think it's kind of a hobby in itself, or, it's like a sub hobby of, and I've kind of done the same thing with the layout that I have. It's, you want a railroad with a purpose when you build, at least I do. I want to lay out with a purpose. And as much as it may be in reality, empty plastic containers moving air from one spot to the other, in my mind, it's not that. It's moving raw material into finished goods. It's going somewhere to go to market. Right. And I want to know all the steps along the way. And it's amazing the stuff you start to learn as you start to really drill into that.
Well, so like, and I might be jumping ahead a little bit here, but the portion of my layout that's kind of active right now, it's almost like a small switching layout, and it focuses around the trackage for a mobile plastics plant where they made, and still to this day, I believe they make trash bags. And people think, oh, plastic pellets, man, that's just boring. It's just a bunch of gray cars. But on my layout, I can count, I think, 5 different routings that brought pellets in. There were pellets from Exxon, pellets from Mobil, Dow Canada, Montel USA, and they're all pellet hoppers, but they're different markings, and they came from different interchange points, and so on and so on. And you just don't think of that stuff until you really dig into it.
Yeah, and it's, again, super cool, the things that you learn, not only about the railroad, but then you learn about industry as well, and how things are made and the products it takes to make them. It's just a really good, if you're just one of those guys that like to know how things are made or how things work or whatnot, it really did to drill into it. It's going to be really rewarding for you.
Yeah, it's you've been on my Facebook page, and I'm sure you see me talk about slag cars all the time, these beat up covered hoppers. And for example, the Chicago and Illinois Midland, just southeast of Springfield, Illinois, they served I think at the time, and I modeled 1995, and I think at the time it was called Reed Minerals, and they loaded out coal slag. I think it was from the Kincaid power plant, and they loaded it in just a mashup of all these different end of service life hoppers, and it went to, I think, the Conrail, the NS, IC, and then they interchanged with the Gateway Western in Springfield. And I had 2 traffic lanes, and it was one of probably the bigger movements on my line. But they went from the CNIM to the Gateway, and then to the Union Pacific in Kansas City, to Owens Corning in Irving, Texas. And then there was another routing of these hoppers that went to East St. Louis, and then interchanged with the CAX to go to a GAF building materials plant in Mount Vernon, Indiana. And both places made shingles out of the coal slag. So that was like the black gritty stuff on the outside of the shingles.
Oh, wow. Cool. Yeah. See how much you learn, how shingles are made and the materials that are made of them just from searching that. And it's funny because, from wherever you're having them made on my layout, now I'm bringing the shingles in, the finished product, by boxcar to be distributed, which is a representation of what East Coast Materials Management was doing right here in Plainfield, receiving 60-foot high cubes full of gaff shingles, and they were putting them on trucks and sorting them out. So yeah, it's funny how it all ties together, right?
And I'd like the record to show that was not rehearsed or planned.
No, it was exactly. It's so cool to do that. And I sat on the internet and banged around, and I can't say that mine is 100% accurate, but I would look and say, okay, where would this likely be coming from? And then search, and then Google Maps is your friend. If you can go and see that the plant is rail served, then it makes sense. I can justify this. Okay. It's likely coming out of here and going up to here or there or whatever. But yeah, it's so much fun. It's like I said earlier, it's just another aspect of the hobby, where you become not only learning about industry or whatnot, but you become a history buff as well, because you're learning how things have changed, and just amazing. Let's talk about the Gateway Western as a prototype and what you've learned about that. And you mentioned seeing them when you were younger, and you've kind of fallen in love with the Gateway Western, but talk about what you've learned and what the prototype is doing for operations. And then how you're incorporating that into your current layout.
Well, so yeah, the Gateway is long gone. It's been folded into the Kansas City Southern And, of course, now that'll be part of the CP. But I fell in love with these black and yellow engines that I saw, and in the early 90s, and I wanted to learn about them. And so, just real quick overview, the Gateway Western was born from the disaster that the ICG line from Kansas City to St. Louis to Chicago was. They sold it off, went to the Chicago, Missouri and Western in, I think, 87, 88, almost immediately failed. And then the line got split up with the Southern Pacific taking the St. Louis to Chicago line. And then with the backing and funding from the Santa Fe, the Gateway Western was formed to operate this line across Missouri from Kansas City to East St. Louis. And the Santa Fe wanted to use it as their access to St. Louis that they never had. And as I got deeper into, I knew I wanted to model the Gateway Western, and initially I wanted to model Kansas City, specifically the ex-Kansas City terminal track that they operated and switched. But I quickly realized that would just be a monumental undertaking. I probably would have had to have purchased Microengineering as a company to supply myself with enough switches for that. And so I started looking out to the rest of the line, and I really focused in on it was an area just north, probably an hour and a half north of the St. Louis area. It's called Root House, and it was where the line hit from St. Louis, went almost straight north and then made like a hard turn west to head towards Kansas City. And there was a Y where the main line made the curve to go west. And then off that Y came a little yard. And then there was a branch line to Springfield, Illinois, where they interchanged with the Chicago and Illinois Midland, the IC, and the Southern Pacific. And then off of that branch line was another little branch line to Jacksonville, Illinois, where this plastics plant was that we talked about. And they also had an interchange with the BN. And I was like, man, this could be really cool. We've got the mainline trains swinging through the yard and picking up and setting out. And then I really love slow, kind of local switching. So I'd have a couple of local trains that just went and switched and, brought cars back, and then they blocked them and sorted them for pickup by these road freights. And I started really looking at it, and I was like, man, this could work. And then I just kept researching and figuring out, where stuff went. I had bought a whole mess of pictures and slides, I think, from John Kohlberg off eBay, and we ended up connecting. And I didn't realize, but he had actually worked for the Gateway Western for a time, and he still had a bunch of paperwork, industry movement reports and some waybills and all that kind of stuff. And he hooked me up with a bunch of that. And it helped me really start figuring out where all these cars were going that I was seeing. And my buddy Ryan Crawford that I had told you about, he linked me up with a bunch more paperwork, waybills, things like that. And I started really mapping out what all these cars were. And Ryan and I, we would look at photos, and we'd be able to say, okay, cool, there's 3 slag cars. There's an Exxon pellet car. There's a couple center beams for the CNIM lumber transload. And we started amassing all this information into a database, recording. Whenever we would see a picture, I'd go in and do date and what cars were in it. And now I've got this massive resource of traffic that moved on the line. and I'm able to use it almost with like I've got a random number generator setup that I use that tells me how many cars will be in my train. And then it generates that many random numbers that I bounce off the database. And then that tells me what the train is.
Wow.
So no train is ever exactly the same. And it's kind of like a it's almost like a railfans railroad, because it's very similar. You know, it has the look, but it's always different.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, be able to shift up and create variety in your operating sessions is certainly a cool thing to do. And you put a lot of time and effort into making sure that happens.
Very much so.
So you've got all this information on the prototype, and now you're starting to, you've got the bug has already bit you firmly, and you know you're going to start to do a layout. Where do you start to develop a plan for the layout that you're currently working on?
Yeah, so I moved to the Chicago area in 2020. We ended up building a new house. It was wild. We actually signed the papers on building this house, I think a week into COVID. So before the prices went up. So that was the score for me. But it had a really good sized basement, and my wife, she agreed that she would take everything above the basement and I could have the basement as long as it was well done.
Nice.
It had to be presentable. It had to look good. And
well, let's talk about that, because that's one of the notes I wrote down. I'm looking through the photos on your group, and you certainly have the finish, right? These so you've kind of gone with a design where you have these pony walls that are that you're building the layout off of, at least in the few photos I saw. But what I also noticed is a finished floor, finished walls, trim. Even the pony walls are all sheetrocked and clean, and nice paint and great color down there. And you even went as far as painting the ceiling black. And those are the things that I noticed. So yeah, you're going for that really nice finish.
So we'll thank my wife for the aesthetic. We actually, I knew that I wanted it to look good, because I wanted a space that I could have people over. It would be comfortable. I wanted a space that would be comfortable to work in. And it definitely delayed the start of the layout, because it took a lot of, time and financial resources to do that and to do it right. And I'm very glad that I did. But we kind of, I worked with the contractor for the basement, and as you and I talked about, my buddy Isaac, who you had on, I knew what I wanted to model, and just between us, it's not complicated. My track plan was really Google Maps. Yeah. And I told Isaac, I said, man, you're really good with this stuff. I've got this space. I kind of in my head pretty much know what I want to do, but I have no idea how to bend it and twist it and make it so that the turnouts fit. And Isaac was like, let's do it, and we started toying around with ideas. Lots of conversations with Ryan, lots of conversations with Joe out there in Iowa. And we finally settled in on this, what you see now. And once we had that, I was able to tell the contractor, okay, this is what we're going to do. Let's start the basement. And like you said, I had him build these pony walls so that, I had something to really build the layout off of that just looked good. And that's kind of where that started from. And Isaac, the guy's just, he's a savant when it comes to, fitting track into places. And we were able to faithfully replicate all of the track work on my line with two exceptions. there's a small yard that wraps around the north side of the Y in Root House that had 4 short tracks. We had to drop it down to 3. And then our other compromise was the mobile plastics plant. The factory was naturally on the east side of the track, which would have put it in the aisle on my layout. So we mirrored, the track is accurate, but we mirrored it so that the, all the track that was on the west side is on the east side now, and vice versa, so that the structure would be on the back side. And, I'm sure you saw the track plan, Ray, and that area where we put Jacksonville, there's a very large area where the wall kind of, creeps back. And so we're going to build probably a 8 or 9 foot long, rendition of this plastics plant. It is just going to be fabulous when that day comes.
Yeah, and that'll give you a great opportunity with an industry with a lot of switching. And, that's one thing that, I think you're figuring out, or you've already figured out. It doesn't take a lot of industries to build a lot of switching. You can do a lot of switching at one industry if you get the right one.
It takes about an hour to an hour and a half to switch that plastics plant. So it's got 4 tracks. There's 10 spots. You can fit, I think it was about 7 or 8 off spot there. And I love random number generator, and that's kind of how we pick spots. Is we know there's 10 spots, and if we have 7 cars coming in, I'll generate 7 random numbers, and it assigns them to the different cars. And if there's 3 cars that get spot 3, that means 2 of them got to go in the off spot, and then every session we include the off spots with the inbound cars and, regenerate spots for them. And it's complicated, man.
Well, it's certainly a great way to make sure that a job isn't the same twice in a row, and it all depends on how often you operate, how important that is. But if you operate often, which I hope most people get a chance to do, because that's why you built your layout, if you're building one for operations, is to actually operate it. Yep. To make sure that it is fresh, that it's a slightly different. And I've got a way with one of my jobs of actually using a dice roll. You're doing it a lot more technical than I am. I've just got a dice sitting there, and you roll the dice, and it changes the job up every time. Mm-hmm. So of course now they're rolling the dice across the layout, and it's knocking stuff over and whatever. So we got to come up with a different way of doing it. But nonetheless, I do like that. It's kind of reminiscent of what I'm trying to do with mine, and a fantastic idea for somebody who wants to shake it up a little bit. You can come up with a way to make it a little more random.
Yeah. And I was able to get, when we first started the layout, I built, I'm going to say it's a 10 by 20 by 8 foot switching layout. It's very spread out. There's not a ton there, but it's nice, spread out. It's fun to operate. And I got that active. And then over time now, I've been kind of working in the other direction, doing all this framing, a lot of wiring, just trying to get a rock solid base in place. And I'm getting real close to turning that corner to starting in on getting the track on the rest of the layout laid.
Yeah, so I saw some updates there, and we're going to share a lot of these photos in the track plan that Isaac Fabris did for you. Isaac is a very talented track planner. I was turned on to Isaac by my good friend Joe Mammy, who's also a very good track designer. And when he told me about Isaac's work, we got him on here, and we were able to talk a bit about that. And I look forward to getting Isaac back again and talking about track planning again. But it was certainly great that you struck up a friendship with him, because that's a great place to start, is with a guy that has a vision for putting this together. So you've got you've got some bench work going, plus you got an operational part of your layout. So, and then of course you had the contractor in there to do all this. So you've been a pretty busy guy with all of this. And this kind of leads into my question, because I noticed that you've had some work done by Rob Arsenault at Weather My Trains. And
yes.
Yeah, man, you talk about, he might be, you've got Isaac Fabris, great track planner, and then you go right to the top with Rob and the work that he's able to do with weathering. And certainly want to talk about that, but it kind of leads back to a question that I kind of maybe rhetorical. Everybody's going to have a different answer. Maybe some will say you never do it at all, but that idea of when is it time to farm out? There's so much going on. You've got goals in your mind of completing your layout, getting it operational, doing scenery, or maybe scenery is not your thing. Or when is it time in your mind? When was it time to say, you know what? I could probably watch 100 different YouTube videos of weathering and try to figure it out. What was that decision for you to say, I'm gonna send this to Rob and I'm gonna have him do his thing on it?
Well, I think a lot of this comes from knowing your limits, and knowing what you enjoy. And I feel like I may take, some flack, from people out there. And I really don't like to call myself a modeler. I'm more of a collector and an operator. I'm like a bull in a china shop when it comes to fine details. and I love all that stuff, but it's just not me. Add on top of that I'm very busy with work. And I work in transportation, in operations, and let's just be honest with ourselves, man. There's an opportunity cost to everything. And I know what I enjoy. I enjoy wiring. I enjoy track work. I like working with lumber, woodworking and stuff like that. I'm not a good modeler. I'm a great researcher, horrible modeler. Yeah. So I think that's where, I'm very blessed, to be in a position where I can afford to work with somebody like Rob, on the scale that I do. And it's not just Rob, he does the lion's share of my stuff, but I've got another, Ryan Crawford does stuff for me. My buddy Danny Welch here in Chicago does stuff for me. And then I've got another guy, Jonah Hemingway, who he's starting to do some stuff. Of course, Rob does most of it, but I just knew, Ray, between you and me, man, for this little branch line layout I've got upwards of 1,100 cars. Oh man. I thought I had a problem. Yeah. That's cool. That's a lot. That's a lot to manage. Because, I go back to what I said, where it's a rail fans layout. And I don't want that same ICG 4750 rolling through the scene. So what did I do? I got 14 of them for my slag service. Right. And because I want to be able to have these same types of cars that appear, but, slightly different variations. And you see that. Rob is just a master at his craft, and so are the other people that I work with, man. And, they're able to take these identical cars and give them all, life and a personality that translates into the layout and takes it from being, dull and kind of just repetitive and really makes it interesting, especially, I'm not a dummy, man. I know that gray pellet hoppers, they're not exciting. But when you see what, Rob and Danny, they've done on my pellet hoppers, have done with the weathering, they're all slightly different, and it just really brings the layout to life. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple, for at least me, a couple great takeaways from this idea of farming the stuff out or having somebody else, or even for my case, I like to consider my layout like a learning layout where I'm not offended. And I certainly like actually to have people come over, and if they have something to teach, well, teach it right here on the layout.
You know, you can, and what it ends up being is a great story in itself. To when somebody comes over and says, and I can say, "Yep, this area actually was done by this person," or you know, we worked together on this, and it just kind of brings that kind of that group friendship together right to the layout. And time is a commodity. And, you know, for guys like us, we're fairly young. We've got families, and, you know, we got jobs. And at times, both of us, we were talking about that before the show, how demanding our jobs can be with, you know,
got a daughter with a horse.
Oh yeah. You're in it deep, man. I'm trying to avoid that like the plague, you know, that she's out riding horses, and, you know, it's great. She can ride the horse and leave it there, and maybe we'll buy a bale of hay to feed it or something. But I certainly don't want any ownership. So God bless you on that one. But it's you know, there's so much other things going on, and you want to be able to get to a certain point. And to me, there's certainly nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong either way. If you have to be the guy or gal who does everything on your layout and be able to check every box that it was all 100% you, that's awesome. That's awesome. But I think there is a point in your head where you got to decide exactly that. Is this fun for me to do, or is this a chore? And what's the value of my time if I can pass this to this person who's really good at DCC installs? Now, I've done DCC installs, but I've also farmed a few of them out to a good friend on Iris, who's the expert in putting these things together, and he can do it a lot faster than I can, and certainly a lot better than I can. So I'll farm that out, and in the meantime, I'll go back to doing scenery work, or I'll go back to doing I love bench work too. I'm certainly, you know, in that same category. If I could just build bench work and be done, I'd be a very happy guy, because it's a lot of fun to do.
Well, and Ray, you really you hit on something there that, you know, I think like you might have seen. I just posted a video on my way back from a business trip to Indianapolis. I swung by my buddy Kevin Normans, who he's with. He owns Notch 8 Customs, and he does my sound, LED, scale sound speakers, all that stuff. And I picked up a couple of engines, and it's another thing. I'm just like, I'm sure I could learn how to do it, but man, it's easier for me to do that and have him do it, because I'm looking at the end goal, you know, and what do I really like? And I really like operating, you know, I like operating, and I want to get to a point where I can have, you know, full blown functional operating sessions. And I've made a commitment to myself that I'm not going to put cars or locomotives on the layout unless they're weathered, they have scale sound speakers, they have, you know, sound, like everything is just, I'm not bringing it on the layout until it's good. And I could putz around for the next decade, you know, or I could, you know, leverage my network, and I want to operate trains, man.
And that's the one thing that's neat when you get in a group and you find out where everybody else's strengths are, and you're able to help out. I know in our group we do the same. I have my strengths, and I love doing graphics. I love doing that kind of stuff. And, you know, Don does installs. We barter back and forth. I do this for him. He does that for me. And then, you know, we've got other guys like, you know, like Mark Herrick. You know, he's a great scenery guy, and, you know, we'll barter back and forth. I may go over and do something for him. He does something for me. And it's really cool. And then, you know, now it's just us, you know, helping each other out, and it's just a lot of fun. And it's a lot of fun to go over to somebody else's layout and say, hey, I did that. You know, it's, you know, I'm helping, I'm contributing to a great layout, or, you know, and I hope they in sense feel the same way when they've come over and helped me, that they've made a contribution to a layout that's fun to operate. So it really is. It's a really neat way to connect with people, you know, bring people into your layout and make them a part of it.
Totally agree.
So, and I see when you do bench work, you have the same friends that I have. And there's certainly, you know, I learned this a while ago in a club that, you know, that quick clamps are your friend, you know, that you can't have enough quick clamps, and they certainly are a huge help. So I see you've got plenty of those types of friends around to help you get that bench work put up.
Yeah. No, I've got a ton of clamps. And self-admittedly, I'm probably, especially in today's day and age of shelf brackets and foam, I might be overbuilding the layout.
Yeah. Let me tell you this, it's better to overbuild than to underbuild, because underbuilding goes, when your layout starts to sag at an angle and whatnot. I'm an overbuilder too. I build shelves that could put, engine blocks on, and it's for my wife's clothes. And
well, that's what I was going to say. I'm clocking in at right around 300 pounds, and I feel like probably 80% of the layout I could probably do pull-ups on.
Sure. Hey, that's certainly better than the alternative, of a layout that sags and falls down. You've done a great job. I certainly admire in the photos that, again, we'll share on Facebook, and we'll put a link to all of that, where you can see the track plan and see Matt's progress as he's building the Gateway Western Subdivision 6. That'll all be on the Facebook page. So we're going to wrap it up here on Around the Layout. Before we do that, what's the next big major accomplishment for the Gateway Western Subdivision 6? What's the next checkbox to get a mark in it?
I'm going to have to break out the table saw and rip down 8 4x8 sheets into a top for all that framing that you see. And then from there, I'm going to build out the contours to form the front edge of the layout, all the curves and stuff. And, what I've done with Isaac's track plan, and you've got to go way back on the Facebook page to see this, but I print it out to scale. And then I lay it out on the wood, and then I'll trace out the edge of the layout, and I'll kind of, cut it so that it matches the curves, and I can put Homosote down, and then I use a marking tool to just run down the center lines of the track. But that's what's next: plywood, Homosote, get my backdrop frame built up the middle of the peninsula, and from there, we'll go back to the kind of the cottage industry thing. I've got Jeff Otto building just a ton of custom turnouts for me. He's in Milwaukee, does amazing work. I got to drive up there and pick all that stuff up. And once that Homosote's down, I think the track work should come together pretty quickly. And God willing, I'm having David Barrow style, kind of plywood central operating sessions this summer.
Well, that's great. Great way to shake it down and test it out and make sure everything's there. It's funny, everything, even great track planners who put things together, there's always, after an operating session, a different view of it. So that'll be good to get that done and get guys over to shake it down for you.
Yes, sir.
Matt, I want to thank you for coming on Around the Layout. It's been great learning about the Gateway Western and your story, and looking forward to having you back on the show, and we'll get some more updates on the layout. And we'll, again, for anybody that's been listening, go to the Facebook page. You'll see the track plan. You'll see all the photos, and we'll share all that out as well. So, Matt, again, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.